Good evening. Welcome to WBUR CitySpace. It's nice to see everyone's shining faces on a beautiful 80-degree day, my goodness. My name's Stephen Davey. I'm the senior producer here at WBUR CitySpace. Back in the fall of 2020, Franklin Foer signed on to write a book about Joe Biden. As he tells it, his publisher was looking for the cliche 100 Days of a Presidency book. But for Frank, that trope was not enough for a book, so he continued reporting. Then as the first year passed, then as the second year passed, Frank finally found the story, a story that could stand the test of time. Who is Joe Biden as president? We've known him for a long time as a senator, then as Obama's VP. Franklin Foer dives deep on this question and reveals a portrait of a real politician who believes in bipartisanship and institutions. As the title suggests, perhaps Biden is the last politician. Guiding us along the way tonight is our moderator, WBUR senior political reporter, Anthony Brooks, and we're taking your questions. Head to slido.com and enter 4, and we'll get to as many as we can. Also, after the program, Brookline Booksmith, our partners tonight, are set up out there with books that Frank will sign for you. So, now, please help me welcome Anthony Brooks and Franklin Foer.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. Frank Foer, thank you for coming, and thank you for this remarkable book. It's really been a pleasure to read. And I want to dive right into it, but first, I just want to ask you about this news today out of Washington. Kevin McCarthy is no longer Speaker. You probably heard. As someone who's written about Joe Biden, thought a lot about Joe Biden, has sort of figured out who this man is, what's he thinking about right now in terms of there's no Speaker of the House right now?
Yeah. Well, thank you. An intimate discussion about politics. What could go wrong? So Kevin McCarthy, Joe Biden came to Washington as president with the hopes of restoring the system, that he wanted to show that institutions could still function, that there would be some sort of return to some sort of semblance of normalcy after the madness of Donald Trump. And the ousting of Kevin McCarthy certainly is not evidence of institutions functioning. And I think what Joe Biden looks at right now is this future where Congress is going to be stuck in this cycle where it's going to be leaderless, it's going to be run by the most insane faction in the body. They're not going to be able to pass the basic spending bills that allow parks, zoos, veterans benefit, all these things to function. There won't be aid for Ukraine flowing in the immediate future. And McCarthy was somebody who was in a very weak position to begin with.
Yep.
And I think Biden understood that. He first met him in the course of negotiating the debt ceiling bill. And McCarthy came into the Oval Office and met with Biden. And Biden, I think, sized him up pretty quickly as somebody who was not a strong leader, who was a rookie. And he felt, like, in his first discussion with him, that he could take this guy to the cleaners. And so at the start of their relationship, Biden understood his insecurities. And so he made this calculation that if he let McCarthy dominate the debt ceiling negotiation by being the one who strolled out the White House driveway and talked to the press while Biden just kind of sat back, that McCarthy would feel like he was winning. And Biden had the sense that he could beat him on details behind closed doors, which was, in fact, what happened in those negotiations.
Interesting. So this question is cynical, and why would I ask a cynical question if we're talking about politics? But, I mean, there is a reelection campaign underway. Does this help Biden? Because it seems to me it can kind of give him the ammunition to say, look at the chaos that the Republicans continue to sponsor.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that's going to seem like a newsflash to most Americans. I mean, I think most Americans probably associate the Republican Party to some extent with chaos at this point. I think it probably helps him somewhat, but in the end, because if you were to go back and look at what happened when there were government shutdowns under Obama and Clinton, those both exploded in the face of the Republican Party. They helped the Democratic incumbents. And you would think that that's what would happen this time. But there's so much about the unhealthy state of American economy, American life, that Joe Biden owns now. And so maybe there's a way in which this doesn't help him. If there's, I don't know what happens to the bond market. I don't know what the stock market does in reaction to all of this. And Republicans won't look great. But I have a feeling that it might just exacerbate the sense of unease and foreboding that a lot of Americans have right now.
So let's move on to the last politician. So I wanted to start with Biden's campaign for reelection. And I sort of wanted to start there because I'm sort of thinking about this a lot because I'm spending a lot of time running around New Hampshire chasing the Republican candidates. Biden is 80, oldest president in history. He's 86 by the end of his second term, should he win. What drives him? Why does he want to run again as the oldest president in history? What did you learn about that?
Yeah, so there's so much about Joe Biden that's familiar to people, and he's treated as this boring character by much of the world. And what I think we're both fans of Richard Ben Kramer's classic book, What It Takes, which was about the 1988 presidential campaign. And Joe Biden was one of the stars of that remarkable book because he was somebody who wore his insecurities and ambitions on his sleeves. And it's amazing that you could end up in your 80s, you could be president of the United States, and you could still be an insecure person. And that's just the nature. We age, and so an age changes us in certain ways. It may give us a certain amount of wisdom. It may mellow us and take the edge off of some of our insecurities, but a lot of those insecurities persist. And I think there's part of Joe Biden who feels like he hasn't gotten the credit for the credit he deserves for what he's done as president. I think there's a sense that he has that he's an indispensable person, which I think most presidents have some version of that they internalize, that he looks at the 2000 race and says, I beat Donald Trump once, and I'm therefore the best person to beat him again. Being the Dragon Slayer is, it's a very comforting thing to believe about yourself. And he may not be, you look at the polls right now, there's this overwhelming sense that he's not the preferred opponent to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And I see the wisdom of that line of thinking, but it's there's a lot of wish casting that happens in politics where you dream that there is this ideal candidate out there, and especially when a race is settled like this one is settled between two choices that are widely considered unattractive. But maybe that perfect alternative doesn't exist. As a candidate, Joe Biden has certain things that other people don't. I mean, he has beaten Trump. He's been able to bridge a lot of differences within the Democratic Party very effectively. He has an agenda that he can run on. And the alternative might be the 2016 race where you had Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton, and that just left so many terrible feelings within the Democratic Party that they were never able to shake. And you could argue that those terrible feelings were a primary thing that contributed to that slim margin that pushed Donald Trump over the top.
Yeah. So we've got a good question related to this from the audience. Age comes up constantly with Biden. Does he really want to be president in his late 80s? And I would add to that question, you spent a lot of time reporting on him, up close to him, talking to people who know him. Is he too old? Does he have the energy to do this job? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So this is the type of name dropping thing you get to do when you're a political reporter. But I was in the White House, and I was going to see Biden with a group of columnists, and Barack Obama came bounding down the hall. And Obama had just had lunch with Biden, and he was visiting with Jeff Zients, who's Biden's chief of staff. And Obama came out, and his tie was halfway down. And I asked him, "Is there anything about this place that you miss?" And he said, "No." He said, "I miss some of the people, but there's nothing about. I have no attachment to this place." And it just seemed like he was very happy not to be president of the United States anymore. And then you go in the
other
Oval
Biden
Office and you
has,
see Joe Biden.
Right.
You're like, this guy is having the time of his freaking life.
Interesting.
He loves being leader of the free world. I mean, it's something he wanted to do since he was in his 40s, probably, much earlier than that. And he loves foreign policy. He loves talking to other leaders. He's a politician who genuinely loves other politicians. He likes thinking about how their minds work. He likes the process of making deals. I think he's talked about the White House feeling a little bit lonely at times, but I think he genuinely enjoys the job. And for some people, just as relates to this age question, the question, why do older politicians have such a hard time letting go? And I think the answer is much the same reason that your parent doesn't like handing over the keys to the car, which is that the alternative is to stare pretty hard at your own mortality.
Right. So one of the big themes in this book is this idea, and you touch on it early in the book, that this idea that Biden has always been underestimated throughout his political life. And he was underestimated, I think, by you. You initially thought of him as a bloviator who dangerously fetishized bipartisanship. Why did you initially believe that about Biden? What was the evidence that sort of brought you to that conclusion?
When I was 24 years old and was a cub reporter, I was able to get Joe Biden on the phone. And 5 minutes into the conversation, I was asking myself, how am I ever going to get this guy off? And his stories go on forever. He's somebody who is just filled with nostalgia for these figures from the past. He was probably nostalgic when he was 24. He loves hearing his own voice. I think there's also, if I'm self-critical and self-aware about this, there's also an element of class to maybe my feelings about Joe Biden, that Joe Biden was somebody who came from Scranton, who thought of himself as blue collar.
Yep.
That was the Democratic Party that he grew up in. And then in the 70s, as he was in office, the face of the Democratic elite started to shift. You had a bunch of Ivy League meritocrats who became the dominant elite in the party. And they were people, I mean, I place myself probably in that category. I don't think I could place myself in any other category. Who, when they listened to Joe Biden engage in his soliloquies, couldn't help but think of him as not as smart as they were. Yeah. And so the arc of my story really is of my coming to respect the kind of the streetwise qualities of a good politician.
Yeah.
And it's the arc of the Obama-Biden relationship as well. That I was on a podcast with John Favreau, the Pod Save America podcast. Favreau was a speechwriter for Obama. And when Obama ran for president, he would put all these lines in his speeches about how Washington was terrible, how politics as usual was terrible. And then in the middle of the administration, Obama said, I understand why you include those lines in your book, but really, I don't believe them anymore. And his point was that over time, he'd come to respect the wisdom of figures like Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and especially Joe Biden. And Obama had rolled his eyes as hard as anybody in the White House at those Biden stories. And by the end of their time, they'd actually become genuine friends, and there was this core of respect to their relationship.
That's interesting. And I want to come back to this idea about sort of the way he has always been underestimated and these legislative victories and all kinds of other things that have happened in his presidency so far. But I just want to stick to this idea of Biden's verbosity. At one point in the book, you credited Richard Ben Kramer, who we mentioned, who wrote this wonderful book, What It Takes, and you credited him with helping you understand Biden. And you wrote this great thing late in the book. You said that you didn't have the kind of access to Biden that Ben Kramer did, but you wrote, the great thing about Biden as a subject is his verbosity. He does a terrible job at suppressing his internal monologue. His staff and friends have a clear understanding of his mind because they are exposed to so much of it. So I just loved that, and it was a great insight into how you wrote this book. But can you give us an example of that, where you got a sort of glimpse of, where someone talked about this verbosity of him sort of, speaking outside of his head and making things up as he goes along? And
I mean, I just like when you walk in. One of the times I was in the Oval Office, Biden turned to the group of reporters and said, "What's on your mind?" And we're like, "Well, Mr. President, what's on your mind?" And he's like, "Glad you asked." And it's like 2 hours later, you emerge from this monologue. I mean, there are just all these examples where after his he's very hard to schedule because everything goes on for so long. So when he brings in members of Congress, it's when he was negotiating the Build Back Better deal, you couldn't schedule it in half-hour chunks. You have to schedule it in 2-hour chunks because those conversations just don't stop. And it's because, I mean, there are many reasons why this is so. I mean, primarily, he just can't help but tell these stories. That's how he's a very narrative thinker. And so he processes the world and explains the world through stories. And it makes him a very specific type of principle to staff, so that if he's a very hard person. So when you come in to a meeting with Joe Biden, when you're an aide, you need to anticipate the types of questions that he'll ask you, which usually pertain to how can you help him prepare for his next conversation with a politician.
Right.
And so he needs to be able to get the raw material that will allow him to persuade the specific politician he's about to meet. So one of his aides is a guy named Bruce Reed, who Joe Biden, at the beginning of his administration, had 3 former chiefs of staff, of his own chiefs of staff, working for him. And Bruce Reed had been his chief of staff when he was vice president. And he comes into meetings with Joe Biden, who he's worked for decades, with index cards with the answers to these trying to anticipate the very specific questions that Joe Biden will ask. And if you're not able to answer those questions, if you're not prepared for those questions, he has what he calls an Irish temper, and he'll really unload on you. And especially junior staffers who haven't dealt with Biden before find him to be just the worst boss. There was a story I had from when Biden was in Geneva preparing for a press conference after a meeting with Putin, and the State Department protocol officer came in and started to feed him some things to say about, and Biden said, "You're a horse's tail," and dispatched the person from the meeting. And those types of stories are legion with Joe Biden.
So at a time when this nation seems hopelessly divided along partisan lines, Biden still believes in the idea of bipartisanship. And in fact, during the first 2 years, and you write a lot about this, of his administration, he oversees some huge legislative victories. And I want to ask you a little bit about this. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a green energy bill as much as anything else, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, there's other stuff as well. How significant are these legislative accomplishments?
I think that they're significant, and what's interesting is how they add up potentially to more than the sum of their parts.
Yeah.
So really, in aggregate, what they do is they give the government a different sort of role in the economy. So for generations, since Ronald Reagan, really there's been this sense that government needed to be highly deferential to markets, so it needed to have a light footprint when it came to regulation, but also in terms of directing the trajectory of the economy. And what the bills do is turn the government into an investment bank that's making these major bets on big industries that the Congress has decided will be the industries of the future, whether the green energy industry or the semiconductor industry. And they've given the executive branch massive pools of money that it can spend to give those industries a big nudge into existence. And so what the government now does is it's essentially coordinating these investments. And so you take something like the batteries that go into electric vehicles. It's a very complicated supply chain, and it essentially couldn't be birthed if you didn't have somebody coordinating that supply chain at a high level. And so that's the role that the government is now playing. But you take these investments, you take the investments in infrastructure, which are investments in broadband, investments in ports, investments in public transportation, investments in EV charging stations. You take the semiconductor bill, you take the investments in solar, EVs, wind, et cetera. And what the government is doing is it's pouring money not just into the economy and not just into industries, but into places. And so you have Arizona, you have Georgia, you have upstate New York, you have massive parts of the country that are going to be reindustrialized. And it's a form of economic development that, if it's executed in the right sort of way, is really akin to what large parts of the New Deal were able to execute.
And how much credit does he deserve for this? Because, and you go into this in some detail, and it's fascinating. I mean, for example, Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin hammered out the Inflation Reduction Act, the big investment bill into green technology, which seemed to rescue a big part of Biden's legislative agenda. So to what extent does Biden deserve credit for this? And to what extent does it belong elsewhere?
So one of the reasons why I was able to get access for this book was that I wrote a series of pieces during the campaign about the policies that the Biden people were proposing. And one of my frustrations as a political reporter is that people don't take policy proposals seriously. And you see this happen all the time with Donald Trump. No way he's going to, repeal healthcare, Obamacare. But lo and behold, it's something he's proposed. It's something he wants to do. And the Biden people had proposed this massive Build Back Better agenda, which had this vision contained within for reindustrializing the country, for shifting to what I just described, which is called industrial policy, where the state has this coordinating role in the economy. And so the vision really was the campaign's vision. And then you get into the story about the legislative process. Well, that's just an extremely messy story, because legislating, especially when you have a single vote majority in the Senate, is inherently messy. And there were times when Biden lost control over the legislative process, where he became too invested in the arm twisting and the wooing of Joe Manchin, and that relationship became highly pressurized, and it exploded. And Biden understood that he needed to step back at that moment, which was really hard for him to do because he enjoyed playing the role of Senate Majority Leader / president.
Right. I have to believe he went from just being so frustrated and angry with Joe Manchin to sort of loving him.
I don't know if that's. Love is like is a certain valence to it that I'm not sure I would describe. But no, I think. He was so frustrated. So the thing, we talked about Richard Ben Cramer, and one of his great insights into Joe Biden was Joe Biden's obsession with real estate. That Joe Biden is a very status anxious guy who's always trying to trade up into the world, and he cares a lot about his house, and he sunk everything into building his house, improving his house. In that book, Joe Biden is like there actually kind of hammering things together and dealing with water leaks and all these things. And this house is his pride and joy, but he doesn't really use it as his primary political piece of theater. He uses the Oval Office that way. He'll occasionally take people to Camp David. But so when things were wrapping up, or it looked like they were wrapping up with Joe Manchin, he took Manchin to his house in Delaware.
Huh.
And he gave him this tour that went on forever and ever. And for Joe Biden, it was a very special moment. And at the end of this meeting, they went through all of these last details with the bill. It was clear that there were some substantive gaps, but they were very close on it. And at the end of the meeting, they shook hands, and Manchin said, "I'm going to help you get this done." And for Joe Biden, that was the moment. He was like, "Okay, this guy, Joe Manchin, he shook my hand in my house. That's, my word is my bond, et cetera, et cetera." And he walked away feeling like he had Joe Manchin in the bank, but he didn't. And so Biden then goes and tells the Democrats in the House, you have to vote for this infrastructure bill. I know you're worried that Manchin's not going to support the $3.5 trillion social spending bill that you all want, but I know he will get there. And he told them, you can count on that. And he couldn't count on it.
Yeah.
Because Joe Manchin,
Even though he saw his house and everything.
yeah. Yeah.
Right. So he gets big things done, big legislative accomplishments in these first 2 years. But polls suggest that his public numbers are underwater. What explains this disconnect between what he's accomplished, which arguably is big, and these very low poll numbers? And there's a great question from the audience about this. So all the legislative achievements don't seem to be a good story for TV news. How much of a problem is that for Biden's image?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem with his age is that he's just a bad character on television.
Yeah.
I mean, everything about him suggests that he's not a dynamic person, because he looks like a corpse. He walks like I'm serious. It's a very superficial way of judging an individual.
Yeah.
And I think that we live in this time where there's just no faith in institutions. And you take something like the vaccine. So when he comes into office, all right, Operation Warp Speed helps Moderna get off the ground. It helps J&J get off the ground.
And Warp Speed, of course, is Trump's program.
It's Trump's program. But it didn't help. Pfizer didn't take Warp Speed money.
Yep.
And Pfizer was going to emerge as the first vaccine that proved out. It was going to be the workhorse vaccine. And they needed to ramp up the production of the vaccine straight away, which they managed to do with a lot of government assistance. Government Pfizer went from having a dysfunctional relationship with the government to having a deeply integrated relationship with the government. When the Biden people came in, they went searching through the Trump bureaucracy, trying to figure out where the plan was to get these shots into arms, and the plan did not exist. And so within 6 months of Biden coming to office, it was possible to stroll into a CVS or a Walgreens and get a shot that would save your life. It's really one of the best designed, most incredible government programs in the history of humanity. And yet the public doesn't give them any credit for it.
Yeah.
And I think they're very reluctant to crow about a lot of these things. So the vaccine felt terrible to people. The pandemic felt terrible to people even after the vaccine became ubiquitous, because the vaccine didn't make the pandemic go away like we initially hoped it might. We have full employment. We've had basically zero unemployment for many, many months, and they get no credit for that because inflation remains a very significant fact of our economic life. And so I think these are confusing times. The country's kind of suffering from its own version of long COVID, and that we're just still dazed. Our economy's still dazed. People are still dazed. People are in a bad mood in general. They were in a bad mood going into the pandemic to a certain extent. But I think it's the preconditions in this country didn't lend themselves to people crediting an administration for making government work effectively. I think he's not great at messaging.
It's interesting. I think, arguably, I mean, that's sort of been a challenge for Democrats for a while. I mean, I remember Obama coming under a kind of criticism for not being able to tell the story of what was really, what was the most positive aspects of his administration. So it seems to be an issue that afflicts Democrats from time to time. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think Obama was a pretty effective storyteller.
Yeah.
And I think Biden can be an effective storyteller too, but he needs to figure out exactly what the story
is, right.
And
Yeah.
I mean, I think that they did a very good job headed into the midterm elections of defining the election in a very clear sort of way. He gave a series of speeches about the threat to democracy, and pundits didn't like those speeches at all. They said, why aren't you talking about crime? Why aren't you talking about migration? Why aren't you talking about all of these other issues? And Biden said, no, I need to make this election a referendum on Trump, not a referendum on my own presidency. It needs to be a choice. And ultimately, I mean, with an assist from the Supreme Court, which overturned Roe versus Wade,
Right.
he was able to make that case effectively headed into the midterms.
This is a great segue because I wanted to ask you about the midterm election, arguably another big win for Biden. So Democrats defy these historic trends. They hold on to the Senate. Republicans retake the House, but by a very slim margin, of course. The red wave never materializes. And you write, where the pundits lampoon Biden for trying to define the election as a battle for democracy, his argument carried the day. But I do want to ask you about that, even push back a little bit. And you mentioned the Dobbs decision that ended the constitutional right to abortion. That seemed to galvanize Democrats as much as anything else.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, it's. I think that.
And it's an awkward issue for Biden, right?
Yeah.
Because he's Catholic, and he really didn't come out swinging against the Dobbs decision.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the end, the abortion question and the democracy question are intertwined, since they're both about the preservation of liberty and freedom in the face of radical attacks to overthrow those. I think the abortion issue is super fascinating for Biden because he is somebody for whom his Catholicism is a significant fact of his life. That when he, it's part of his nostalgia. He writes, where there are nuns, there was home. So when he thinks about, for somebody who suffered so much in the past, Biden's always longing for the past. When his wife and daughter were killed in the car accident, he lost his faith, and he describes prowling the streets of Wilmington, spoiling for a fight. And then his faith returned to him over time, and it was an important thing that helped him through Beau Biden's death. And then his understanding of abortion, I think, is stuck to some extent in the 1980s when there was more of a middle ground, maybe, that politicians thought they could occupy on the issue. And I don't think that he was very quick to appreciate the radicalism of the Dobbs decision. And so when he talks about abortion, oftentimes his mind goes straight to questions about the religious conscience of healthcare providers. And I don't know why that's, I mean, I think it reflects the ways in which he's somewhat tormented about this. It's an issue he's bonded with over time with Nancy Pelosi and John Kerry, who were also liberal Catholics. And I think it hurts on some level to have the church criticize you when it criticizes you. So in preparation for Dobbs, he just couldn't settle on the right set of policies that he wanted rolled out in response to it. Yeah. And his torment, I think, was kind of obvious to a lot of people in the room. There was also a core of political wisdom in his thinking about abortion.
Explain that.
Which was that the likes of Elizabeth Warren and others wanted him to come out and aggressively turn the government into, if not, into essentially Planned Parenthood into an abortion provider. They wanted to open up access to abortion clinics in the edge of national parks and things like this. And Biden's position was, I can't make this an issue about our policies. It needs to be, this election needs to be decided on their policies. All the spotlight needs to be cast on the Republicans.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think this is probably pretty telling for Joe Biden. It was when there was the 10-year-old girl from Ohio who needed to go to Indiana to get an abortion, and then the weight of the law fell on her doctor. And that for Biden was just a clear morality tale where he was able to grasp, I think, pretty clearly just how far-reaching, radical the Dobbs decision was. And from that point on, he hasn't really been especially tormented.
Interesting. So, a question from the audience related to this: how much of Biden is stuck in his past, like his abortion position? Does that help him, harm him?
I think. I don't think that it's who he is, and so I could give you examples of both, of it cutting both ways. I think that there's certain places where I think it does help him. That I think that he is able to identify certain issues in the culture wars and understand, all right, I've seen this fight over immigration a million times before. I know how this is going to go for the Democrats if we pursue this policy or that policy. I think on foreign policy, it's extremely helpful for him in that you take something like Ukraine, and I say this as a Ukraine hawk myself. Zelensky was so effective at mobilizing Western public opinion and getting people justifiably upset about what was happening in Russia, and then pushing for certain arms packages that he wanted. And so Biden's instinct was to kind of think back to being a kid from the Cold War, having to hide under his desk. And he worries a lot about the prospects of nuclear escalation. And so he will ask very hard questions of his aides about, if we give Russia this package, what will be the consequence? I don't agree with him about a lot of that, but I'm also glad that the President of the United States is sweating the prospect of nuclear war.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So let's stick with Ukraine, because it started badly between Biden and President Zelensky of Ukraine, right? They had some sort of conflict that was related to background and perspective. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I remember when I had my first conversations with a Biden aide on the National Security Council right after the invasion, and I was like, oh, this relationship between Biden and Zelensky, it's a mentor-protege relationship, right? And he laughed at me. And over time, this is not something the administration likes to talk about, but I started to uncover this tension between Biden and Zelensky. And the first time that Zelensky came to Washington, it was September 2021. So it was right after the debacle in Afghanistan. And Zelensky was upset with the Biden administration because the Biden administration had canceled sanctions on Nord Stream 2, the pipeline taking natural gas from Russia to Germany. And Zelensky had made common cause with Ted Cruz in the course of opposing the administration on this. And there was a lot that Zelensky had done that just wasn't very seasoned in the ways of Washington, because Zelensky's last big dealing with a Washington political figure was with Trump, when Trump asked him to dig up dirt on Hunter Biden, resulting in the impeachment of Donald Trump. And so Zelensky, I think, was pretty traumatized by that whole incident. I think that he's some displaced frustration with Biden because Hunter Biden had been the source of a lot of his troubles with Trump initially. And so they get into a room, and Zelensky asks Biden if he can get help getting into NATO. And Biden's been involved in Ukrainian politics longer than Zelensky. He had the Ukraine portfolio in the Obama administration. Zelensky was a comedian who got into politics, and so Biden couldn't look at him and say, hey, you're my fellow politician. He looked at him as a bit of an amateur.
Yeah.
And so as Zelensky was making the case for getting into NATO, Biden just couldn't help but see the amateurism in the ask and the seams in the ask. And Zelensky got really frustrated with Biden, which didn't seem to Biden like the right play on his part. And so somebody described to me afterwards that Zelensky had crapped the bed in that meeting, and things didn't get any better in the run-up to the war because we had such good intelligence about what Russia was about to do in Ukraine. And Biden, Kamala Harris, Tony Blinken all had meetings with Zelensky where they would kind of grab him by the lapels and say, "You're about to get invaded. Why aren't you doing more to prepare?" And Zelensky was very cagey in those exchanges, and it really frustrated the White House.
Interesting. I'm curious what you think the administration's endgame is, or what the hopes for the endgame is in the war between Ukraine and Russia, because it seems that Putin, huge army, lots of weapons, no desire to look weak or be a loser. So given that, how does the Biden administration see this war ending in terms that work for Washington and Kyiv?
Well, so the hope was that you would have this was the hope with the first counteroffensive last year, the hope with this counteroffensive this year that Ukraine would capture so much territory, would capture most of the territory that Russia had captured in February 2022, that Ukraine would be in a very powerful position to come to the bargaining table and conduct a diplomatic settlement to the war. Mark Milley had a metaphor, which was that the military was going to be the offensive line and diplomacy was going to be the fullback that would shoot through the gap. But I think right now, I think the odds of a diplomatic solution are exceedingly low. For starters, Ukraine doesn't have the upper hand right now to sit down at the negotiating table. And then more importantly, Russia has no interest in coming to the negotiating table. There's no partner to be had for the Ukrainians. And so the conflict is also, it's now a war of attrition.
Right.
It's being fought tree line by tree line. And the war is going to change. It's the Ukrainians right now are talking about building up their own arms industry in order to sustain their needs for artillery over the course of the years to come. And we're going to have to help the Ukrainians set up bases within Ukraine in order to maintain and fix all of this equipment that we've given to them. We're going to need to amp up our own production of artillery in order to supply the Ukrainians over the long run. And it's just going to be a terrible, horrible battle of wills for the indefinite future.
Let's stick with foreign policy because I want to make sure we have time to talk a little bit about Afghanistan, because the debacle there around the pullout seemed to mark the end of Biden's honeymoon. It's when his approval numbers fell really for the first time. Arguably they've never really rebounded. So let's talk about the withdrawal. Why did the Biden administration appear to bungle this so badly?
So I'm going to give you the long answer, which is that Joe Biden has a lot of self-confidence as it relates to foreign policy.
Yep.
And he started going to Afghanistan in just after 9/11, just after the invasion of Afghanistan. And he would sleep in a sleeping bag on conference room floors. He would be waiting in the showers with the Marines with the towel around his waist. And he would visit warlords. The warlords would irritate him because they'd say, "Why aren't you doing this for us? Why aren't you doing that for us?" And Joe Biden has this moral code, it's kind of Scranton sense of morality where if you don't express gratitude for a gift, it pisses him off. And it also pisses him off over time because he could see his own son potentially getting sent to Afghanistan and getting sent to fight on behalf of these warlords and fighting on behalf of a ultimately doomed experiment in nation building. And so Joe Biden has this very complicated relationship with the foreign policy elites where he wants their approval, but he can also see them rolling their eyes at him. And so he wants to prove that he's smarter than they are. And he becomes, all this gives him space to be a contrarian on certain issues. And he was a contrarian on Afghanistan. During the Obama administration, he was the one person telling Barack Obama, you need to get out. And he told him, he pulled him aside one day in the Situation Room, and he said, you're a young president, and these generals are trying to jam you. Don't let them jam you. And so he comes in to office, and this is a big priority. It's a priority that is also foisted upon him because the Trump administration had cut a deal with the Taliban to be out of the country, Afghanistan, by May 1st, 2021. And so he had to quickly make a decision about whether he was going to abide by the Trump agreement or not. And he structured the whole decision-making process around getting out of Afghanistan so that it essentially allowed him not to be boxed in by the generals and to get the policy outcome that he'd promised in the course of the campaign. And the big issue I see in the way that he structured that conversation, and it filters all the way down to that horrible month in August 2021, is that his priority was winning the bureaucratic war to get out. It was about not sending any more American soldiers to fight in Afghanistan. It was about geostrategy. It was about redirecting the resources of this nation to focus on the problem of China. It was not about the humanitarian consequences of withdrawal. Those were not the questions that were being asked in the Situation Room when the decision to get out was made. And I don't think it was ever really his priority it wasn't ever at the top of his mind.
Wow. I mean, bad as that pullout was, and as ham-handed as it seemed to be, as ham-fisted. I mean, the administration goes on and manages this amazing airlift, huge airlift, great logistical accomplishment. What, they evacuated something like 120,000 Afghans?
124,000.
124,000. I learned that in your book. But,
can I just pause? You know how incredible this was? It was, so at the beginning of August, we did not have any sort of real plan for getting out Afghans. Most Afghans who were going to leave the country were going to leave them on commercial flights. And then you have this, you have the Ashraf Ghani, the head of Afghanistan, flees. Everything collapsed. The Taliban didn't even want to invade Kabul. They would have preferred there to be a peaceful handoff of power. And so we're stuck working with the Taliban to keep order in Kabul. And then you have the dentist and the soccer player who fall from the airplane, from the C-17 that they're desperate to escape from. And Biden in the Situation Room says, okay, no more C-17s are going to leave Hamid Karzai International Airport unfilled. We're going to fill them with Afghans. We're not going to vet them, but we're going to get them out of the country. And so in the course of a week, essentially, the U.S. military, which is probably the only entity in the world capable of pulling this off, erects essentially a hub and spoke system where refugees leave Kabul every 45 minutes on these massive jets. They go to Qatar. They get processed in Qatar. Some of them end up staying in camps that are erected overnight in Qatar where they're fed, they're processed, their biometrics are collected. Then the State Department has negotiated agreements with bases, countries around the world where we're allowed to house these Afghans on bases. And so we basically create housing flights for 124,000 people in the course of a week.
Wow. And yet, Afghanistan is still remembered as this sort of bungled pullout of American troops. Does he ever express regret about that or acknowledge that? No.
I mean,
that he could have handled that part better.
No. I think he admits that things went badly.
Yeah.
I think he explains it in a way which it was inevitably going to go badly because leaving a war that you've been in for that long, it's the longest war in American history, ending it was never going to end well. And he might be right about that. The problem I have is that he didn't forewarn anybody that that was going to be the case.
Yeah. Let me move on to another subject, and that is his impeachment, the Republican campaign against him. So Republicans in the House, of course, have launched an impeachment inquiry, even though there's no evidence that links Biden to Hunter Biden's business dealing in any corrupt way. How does Biden and his team plan to respond to this? How are they responding to this?
And I think there are a lot of lessons that have been learned from having watched the impeachment of Bill Clinton, even the impeachment of Donald Trump. Impeachment has become this tool of choice that politicians in Washington use to try to destroy the president of the United States. And it's not a terribly effective tool. And even when it's applied, I think in the case of the Democrats, it was applied, especially after January 6th, like 100% justified. It's a political process that stands in for legal processes that are never, ever going to happen, or maybe in the case of January 6th, actually might happen. But certainly this case is not. There's no evidence that prosecutors are ever going to go after Joe Biden for anything having to do with Hunter Biden.
Right. So what's the long game?
And so the long game is that the people who pursue impeachment tend to overreach and look terrible in the process and shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah. So do you see it as backfiring on the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, it may have even backfired on Kevin McCarthy now. If Kevin McCarthy hadn't impeached Joe Biden, I think maybe there would have been more goodwill among Democrats to help bail him out with his speakership.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I guess the only thing it might do is, build a message to run on in 2024 that Biden is somehow corrupt or...
They don't even need to do that because they have the Hunter Biden trial that's going to be happening as a split screen thing while Trump's trials are happening. And this is my frustration with the media heading into this election, which is that there's a lot that's happening in Biden world and Trump world simultaneously that are treated as if they exist on a spectrum.
Yeah.
So Hunter Biden's legal troubles are, nothing like all the ways in which Donald Trump is being rung up by the legal system right now.
Right.
You see this in the questions about Biden's age, which are framed as questions of mental acuity, which are just kind of the other side of Donald Trump having his own issues with mental acuity. But, getting lost in a story or, flubbing a line is not the same thing as being a lunatic.
Right. And yet, I hear this from voters in New Hampshire. I just encountered a woman the other day, a Republican, who's searching. She was a Trump supporter. She's not sure she wants to support Trump. But, she made this statement that sort of blew my mind because she said, well, we all know that Trump is corrupt. He's probably criminal. He's probably going to go to jail. But so is Joe Biden. I mean, we know that, right? Hunter, right? So this sort of whataboutism, I'm not sure. I mean, I think you're right. It probably is drummed up by the sort of split screens on Fox TV for sure. But
I mean, it's not just Fox. I mean, you see this on every network does this.
Yeah, right. So do you think, what's the peril of this kind of seeping through to voters' consciousness, I guess?
I mean, we saw it in 2016. The same thing happened where people started to talk about Hillary Clinton's criminality.
Right.
And
what about her emails?
Yeah, what about her emails?
Yeah.
And it blurred everything in voters' minds. And there's so much anger out there, it doesn't take a whole lot to redirect it in dangerous directions.
So I want to return just a little bit to Biden's, we have just a few minutes left, to Biden's reelection campaign. So during his first campaign for the White House, he wanted to take on Trump and talked about restoring the soul of the nation. Is that still what is driving him in this second campaign, do you think? Is that theme still alive and well in a way?
Yeah, there was a moment I narrated in the book where after Joe Manchin goes on Fox News Sunday and pulls the plug on the Build Back Better legislation, and Biden needs to reassure the left wing of his party that he's not about to abandon them, and he makes this last-minute push to try to get voting rights legislation over the goal line, which was never going to happen. There was never Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema were very clear that they were never going to ditch the filibuster in the name of that legislation. But Biden felt like he had to make a big push to make it happen. And it was the one moment in the course of his presidency where he really started to veer hard from his faith in the soul of America. And he compares Manchin and Mitch McConnell to Bull Connor, and then almost instantly regretted it. One of the saddest moments in his presidency is that he was up at on Capitol Hill, and McConnell had given a speech saying, "This wasn't the Joe Biden I know. Joe Biden I know would never compare his political opponent to Bull Connor." And Biden went to Mitch McConnell's office to try to apologize, and he hadn't made an appointment to do so. And so he knocks on the door and asks to see McConnell, and McConnell's not there. And so you had this sad moment where the old senator was kind of wandering the halls at the low point in his presidency. The other moment where he abandoned his faith in the soul of America, I think, was when he was up with the vaccine mandates. That he came into office promising. When he talked about the vaccine, he was very conscious that he was talking about this political divide, and his primary strategy was persuasion. That I can persuade people to do the right thing. And he got so frustrated with the way in which the issue was being demagogued that he abandoned persuasion and set out to impose mandates on and I think that was one of the bigger mistakes of his presidency, because those mandates weren't built on sound enough legal footing, and they just exacerbated this enormous divide that we had. Vaccination rates didn't skyrocket because these mandates were suddenly in place. They failed, essentially, and they took him away from this core argument that he'd been making.
Let me ask one last question, because I'm getting the signal that we're running out of time here. But so much of the conversation about the presidential campaign seems to still be consumed by Trump, dominated by Trump. I'm curious what you hear from the Biden people, how they want to deal with this elephant in the political room, so to speak.
I think so. The interesting counterfactual is, what would have happened if Donald Trump hadn't run for president again?
Yeah.
Would Joe Biden have felt compelled to run for reelection?
Answer that question. That's a great question.
I think it would have been harder for him to justify it to himself.
Yeah.
I think he feels like he has a unique responsibility to beat Donald Trump. And I don't think that they fear Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is a boogeyman, and so much of the anxiety that exists around the Biden campaign right now has to do with just how scary the prospects are of a Trump victory. And so if it doesn't look like Biden is the clear guy to beat Trump, naturally, Democrats are going to freak out. But I think that really the Trump-Biden alternative is really he's appreciated that this is the best set of political circumstances for himself, that there's no cleaner contrast. Given his faith in the soul of America, I think he believes that there's no way that the country can return to Donald Trump after having seen Donald Trump up close for 4 years. And I hope to God he's right.
Well, on that, Jonathan Foer, thank you so much for the book and
Franklin
for being
Foer.
here tonight. Thank you.
It's okay.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Anthony and Frank. Compelling conversation. Thanks to our partners at Brookline Booksmith. Frank's going to be signing copies out in the lobby in just a few moments, so see him there. And coming up next at CitySpace, join us tomorrow for a conversation with Morning Edition host Steve Inskeep. He's the author of a new book called Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America, with Meghna Chakrabarti from On Point doing the moderating. So thank you all very much.